How do you think something like that impacted you later on in life as you reflect on how difficult that upbringing was?
Oh, definitely. It impacted me for the rest of my life, actually. I was researching not long ago about these very impactful moments from and what causes childhood trauma. And trauma is bad moments that have not been healed, that have not been dealt with in the proper way. And I was reading that two-thirds of all children from all over the world were will suffer an impactful event by the time they reach 16 years old, whether it is the tragic passing of a loved one, being bullied by family members and or at school, or sexual assault. And I went through all three of these by the time I was 9 years old, living in a world of silence, because as an 8 year old that I lost my father, I always heard from my family, shh, you don't talk about the dead. You cannot talk about the dead because it's too difficult, it's too painful, when it should have been like the whole opposite. But you know what? Whatever the level of ignorance was at that time, definitely. And me as a little girl, an 8 year old, if I cannot talk about the dead, which was the worst possible thing that happened to me at that time, I cannot talk about bad things either. So all of these horrible things that happened to me, I mean, in a 1 year span, I kept it to myself because it was all shh, you don't talk about the dead, you don't talk about mental illness, you don't talk about mental health, you don't talk about feelings. She is a little girl, she doesn't understand. And that in my, I mean, in my kid mind, I thought, well, if nobody wants to hear what I gotta say, it's because I am not worth their time. So that's when I went straight down the rabbit hole of low self-esteem, low self-worth, and self-destructive patterns. And that followed me for most of my life, all the way to, I don't know, I could say almost my 40s. So that childhood trauma that went untreated for all of that time, it took me to many ugly, dark places that I threw myself in. I am responsible for all of my actions, but it was all about low self-esteem, low self-worth, not thinking that I was worth anybody's time, because starting with my own mother, I was totally isolated from her. And it wasn't me isolating myself from her. She isolated herself from everybody as a coping mechanism, whatever the case it was. But she, in her mind, it was all about, shh, you don't talk about these things, and pretend that everything is good. And it was never good. It was not good. It was, I mean, my mother was a very violent person. When she had her bouts of going through the down wasn't that she was crying or sad. The down was violent. So I grew up around that kind of violence. My father died violently. My mother went into violence herself. So of course, the generational, repetitive, vicious circle of violence, it was something that was making me company for a very, very long time. I had relationships with, especially the relationship that I had with the father of my kids was a very violent one. And it was infested with verbal, emotional, physical abuse. He was a drug addict. I had problems with drugs and alcohol myself. So you can see here the pattern of self-destructiveness where I was going through. And it was that, until I became a mother, that I said, okay, something has to change, because I ain't gonna end up, these kids are gonna end up without parents, because the path that my ex was following ended his life. He died at 48 years old. And I said to myself, I have to be the voice of reason for these kids. I have to stay, and I have to do something that is bigger than myself, a mission that is bigger than myself, and is be compliant, and find a way out of this. And with hard work, dedications, blood, sweat, and tears, it can be definitely achieved.
I think some people really downplay the impact of a poor childhood. And when I say a poor childhood, I don't mean that, well, mommy, I wanted that toy and you said no. I mean, like, the violence, the neglect, the
Mhm.
emotional unavailability. I think a lot of people don't realize how it impacts you because when you look at the adverse childhood experience, you see how many people who have had difficult childhoods live a life of being promiscuous, lead a life of joining gangs.
Right,
They don't have the certain level of respect for authority. And one of the worst things that I think that comes out of that is that they don't have the respect that they should have for themselves,
right.
right? And they abuse
Mhm.
their bodies in ways that maybe they shouldn't
Mhm.
be abusing their bodies. So you have people that they get into these types of relationships where if there's abuse in their childhood, there's abuse in their relationship because their baseline, their normal is that I
Yep.
grew up in this. This is what I know. Let me go seek it, whether it's conscious or subconscious.